with this discussion of text types, now recently they're starting to get questioned. Like, are text types an actual thing? And it's something that I didn't really pick up on until relatively recent. I mean, it's not a new thing that text types are being questioned, but it kind of came to a head, at least as I started in the discussion of textual criticism. This would have been back in 2006 ish, somewhere around there. So I can't speak about much before that. Um, but it seems now there's a definitive, text types are not a thing. So one, what went wrong, and two, what's going to replace that? You weren't at the
Okay.
recent conference, were you?
No, no, I wasn't. I'm still interested to hear what happened at the Oxford or the Yarnton Manor conference. I followed a little bit of the discussion on Twitter and especially on Facebook, and I've also listened in to some of the people who presented there, things they said previously. So I got a bit of an idea what was going on. So I'm very much not an expert, but I'm an interested onlooker who's done a little bit of an amateur sleuthing in this area, not just theoretically, but I've done some practical work myself in Jude on groupings in Jude. Yeah, I've kind of been watching. So you were asking what's gone wrong. Shall I just kick off there with what's gone wrong?
Yeah. What has gone wrong with text types? Why are they on the chopping block?
They're on the chopping block because people tried to define them carefully. So if you give a careful definition of what a text type is, and then you try to measure it mathematically. So basically coming up with percentages of agreements or percentages of disagreements in comparison with other manuscripts and so forth. Over time, as people gave them more we could give them more kind of definite definition, and we actually tried to measure them, then they started collapsing. And it started to become clear the numbers don't work. The key, it wasn't meant to be a critical paper. It was actually a pro-text type paper. Ernest Colwell and Ernest Tune, sometime in the 50s or very early 60s, came up with this sort of idea that a text type had basically 70% agreement in sort of their distinctive readings, and only up to about 30% disagreement. And every text type was separated from other text types by about 10% disagreement. So they came up with this what's called the 70-10 rule: 70% agreement, 10% disagreement. So 70% agreement within the group and 10% disagreement with other groups. And this looked good. They produced some nice tables of statistics and so forth. But once people started adding in more and more data into these tables, and the tables got bigger and bigger, eventually it became clearer that it was harder to maintain the degree of agreement inside each text type. So the Western text type was never very tight, and was always a bit fuzzy. And also the difference between, say, the Western and the Alexandrian, or the Western and the Syrian text, they had fuzzy edges. The edges became fuzzier and fuzzier. So over time, what's happened is that the groups are kind of dissolved. Now, here we are in 2023. I think still most people would say, yes, there is in some sense or other a Byzantine text type. So the Byzantine text type is a reality. The majority of texts are very similar to each other. They're clearly quite closely related to each other. They have lots of similar readings. There's some sort of genetic relationship between them. And that majority grouping is like the last text type standing.
So
But
so I got to
first,
interrupt you there, right?
yeah.
Right. So we win, right? The Byzantine Prioritist guys, we win, right? That's it. We've knocked out
Okay.
Western, Caesarean, Alexandrian, Byzantine type on top. We've is this not
Yeah,
an
it's
admission that the Byzantine text form is it?
the question is when you start looking at the groupings, you also need to look at things like, well, how old is the grouping and so forth. Now, I'm going to be controversial. I was trying to avoid being too controversial in this conversation, but I'm going to be controversial for a
All
moment. So
right.
So one of the things I've really not been fascinated by text types for a long time. I've only really got into it in the last few
Hmm.
years. One of the things that got into me interested was family 35. So
Hmm.
Wilbur Pickering, family 35, otherwise sometimes known as the KR cluster. So some people call it KR, some people call it family 35. The interesting thing about family 35 is that family 35 is the majority text. It's the majority Byzantine text
Hmm.
of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. So the 14th and 14th, 15th, and 16th century. KR is the majority text, and it is the Byzantine text, and it is very much a Byzantine text. It's from Constantinople, very well represented in Constantinople, very well represented on Mount
Hmm.
Athos. And I was thinking to myself, well, if you recognize that KR is now the clear winner of the process, then why does KX, which is actually what the Byzantine priority position,
Hmm.
why should we think that KX is actually the main Byzantine group? And then actually, when you trawl through the data, it turns out that there have been different families within the Byzantine family,
Yes.
which have been the majority at different points. If you
Right.
trace through the history, family pi or
Hmm.
group pi, then
Family
you
pie
have.
is getting a little more attention lately.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. It's like an early stage
Yeah.
of the Byzantine text. Then you have I like to call it the Omega group because it sounds
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
calling it Omega
That's
group,
right.
but
Sounds like a manga
it's
conversation, like a
family Omega or group Omega, cluster
yeah.
Omega. The next one after pi, and then you have uh, KX as it was called
Yeah.
by von Soden and others. That's basically the Morris Robinson RP text is
Yes.
essentially a KX
KX
text.
test. Yeah.
And then you have Pickering has gone for the KR
KR.
text.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you trace through that sort of history, this kind of like raises questions. Well, what's going on? There's these changes happening within the majority. Which one is the majority at any given time, and how far back in time do each one of these go? And I was very struck by a paper by Georgy Parpolov, who
Oh,
actually
yes.
managed to date and identify the point at which KR takes off, which
Yes.
was
Yes. I saw the paper.
1300, basically
Yeah.
1300 in a particular monastery in Constantinople. Even can identify some of the people probably responsible for it.
Interesting.
And you sort of think, wow, so this new majority text suddenly explodes in the scene of 1300. So if that's the case, what stops that from being the case earlier? In fact, when I started thinking along these lines, I suddenly realized other people have proposed the same thing. So we had a little bit of debate about how to pronounce his name, Frederick Visser, or whatever you think his name is meant to be.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And McReynolds, the guys who worked on the Claremont profile method, they actually explicitly hold to the theory that essentially the Byzantine text is a process, and you have that family pi represents an early stage of it, family omega is a later stage, KX is the next major stage, and it finally comes to the KR
KR.
sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then likewise, Neville Birdsall, who passed away a number of years ago, who was at Birmingham University, which is one of the main centers these days in textual criticism. He in the Cambridge History of the Bible suggested that you could actually identify which dynasty was ruling in Byzantium and which family or manuscripts became popular during the reign of each
Oh, that's
dynasty.
interesting.
He suggests that the KR text is the Paleologian dynasty's text, that the KX text is the Comenian text, that
Right.
Omega is the Macedonian dynasty text. And so now these are all a little bit speculative, but it raises
Sure.
interesting questions. So back to your question, sorry, the long
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What the point is that the fact that you can identify a large group of manuscripts as
Hmm.
being kind of like the last one standing, well, actually, that group is not quite as united as you might think. And further, the fact that you've had different majorities at different times,
Right.
and causes you to think, well, if you go back all the way back past the 8th or 9th century and go all the way back to the 6th or 5th or 4th or even deeper into the past, this whole idea of majorities kind of becomes a little bit questionable. So the majority at any given time does not necessarily represent the majority
Right.
at any previous time.
But yeah, but Byzantine priority isn't necessarily majority. I've made the case before. So
Yeah.
you're not rocking my boat by saying that. But I don't like the fact that you're tearing down the Byzantine text like you are.
Let me be really clear. If we only had the Textus Receptus, or if we only had Family 35, or if we only had KX, the Robertson Pierpont text, if we only had any of those, we'd still have God's word,
Yeah.
and we'd still have the scriptures in the original.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where I'm coming from on that question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you consider we're taking a little bit of a fox trail here, even amongst the Byzantine group. So you're talking about Family 35 and KX and Family Pi and the Omega group. Their readings have a strikingly similar output, right? Like the difference between the various Byzantine groups
Yes.
is nothing like you're going to see between the Byzantine and the current critical method,
Yeah,
the current
absolutely.
critical text.
Absolutely. So that just gets back to our question about why this thing has failed. Part of it is that actually, when you look at the Alexandrian text, the amount of difference that exists between different so-called Alexandrian texts is large enough to kind of call into question, well, is this really a text type? Because yes, they're different from the Byzantine text type, but they're also quite different from each other. And so so not only does they say that the Caesarean text type dissolve, not only does the Western text type kind of dissolve as well, because you actually can't really identify enough manuscripts to make it into a real Greek manuscript family. But also even the Alexandrian texts, what unites them is that they're different from the Byzantine, not that they're massively similar to each other. Now, there are similarities.
Right.
The level of similarity is nowhere near as close to the levels of similarity that you'd find within the Byzantine.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I do think it's worthwhile saying that within the Byzantine family, there are significant differences. So when people say things like, "Oh, Codex Alexandrinus, it's Byzantine," I kind of go, "Yes, it's Byzantine, but not really, not quite as Byzantine as you think."
Yeah.
And then the family Pi, yes, it's Byzantine, but it's not Byzantine in the same way as Family 35 is. You know, there are differences.
Yeah, we actually I recall asking Jeff. So we're still, as like a quick update, we're still working on the Byzantine text form 2025 probably now. We were hoping to have it done this year, but summertime we're all volunteers and everybody's, they got families and stuff, and I mean, I guess they have to pay attention to their families, but so we've got a little database in the back end to house all the variants. And so I had requested Jeff to run some numbers for me just to see how different something like the Hodges Farstad text, how different was that from the Byzantine text form. And I think it worked out to like, we had all guessed. And I was like, well, it's probably going to be like 900 differences. That was my guess. It was actually like 400 and something. Now, we didn't include Revelation for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah. So Revelation probably should be excluded from all of these
comparisons. Of them. Yeah.
Because its particular history kind of skews the analysis.
That's right. But yeah, just and Hodges Farstad was I think it was KX, but they made an interesting selection in I think they went with M5 for the woman caught in adultery, and so RP went with M6, and then Pickering went with M7. Interesting how they all interesting how that went down. But anyway, yeah. So it just goes to speak to the, as much as we're talking about various families within the Byzantine family, and certainly that's true. But again, the differences are quite controlled, quite.
So I think on the question of the Byzantine things, they, certainly from Family Pi onwards, you are seeing a very definite kind of crystallization of a text, and it kind of goes in a couple of different directions as history goes along. Omega is slightly different, KX is slightly different, KR is slightly different, but individual manuscripts can have quite a few larger numbers of variations than that.
Sure, they can, yeah.
But when you just tot up all the majorities, yeah, and that's a tricky thing to achieve, because we still don't really know what the majorities are for lots of manuscripts, because no one's ever actually collated them.
Right.
But from what we can kind of guesstimate what the majorities are, and there are good ways of guesstimating the majorities. Well, I'm not at all surprised that the differences between Farstad, Hodges and Farstad, and the RP text, it's going to be pretty close. Minimal. It's going to be pretty close. And I know there's I don't know the numbers without Revelation. I do know the numbers with Revelation, but family 35 and the KX text, there's only about 1,000 differences, I think, something in that order. And most of these differences are, interchanges between you plural and we plural, so the standard human, to the Greek, the human changes.
Yeah, that's right.
It would have sounded exactly the same to them.
So text types, just as we're talking about what went wrong with them, the edges of what could be considered a text family or a text type, we use text type. They kind of got fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier until the point where they essentially collapsed under closer scrutiny. So text types now are going the way of the dinosaur. The newer textbooks will probably not talk much about them except for how dumb they were. Okay, maybe not dumb. Okay, we won't say that. They were useful for a time. But I don't know. Were they? Because if there wasn't really much to them, then wouldn't that be a little bit deceiving?
Deceiving.
But
you're going to love this again. But the Byzantine text is still useful, and the Robertson Pierpont edition is a useful text, even for scholars who disagree with it in terms of do they think it's the original text? Because having an accurate idea of what the majority is, or what the majority became by the medieval period, is really helpful in just sort of seeing how other manuscripts then compare to that majority. So manuscripts that are kind of quite aberrant or kind of divergent from the majority, you can identify them by collating them against Robertson. The work I did in some groupings I did in Jude, it was vital for me to have the Robertson Pierpont text, because that gave me a kind of baseline, which allowed me to see, these are some interesting variant texts. But you're right. I think the new textbooks in the next decade or so will begin to move away quite clearly from text types, and they'll move towards methods which are more mathematically orientated and more oriented towards individual manuscripts. And it's because we have computers. And it's not the computers are making decisions.
No.
The computers are better at keeping track of numbers than we are.
It's really interesting. I forget who it was. Somebody in one of the Facebook groups suggested that we rework all of the CBGM choices made without using Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which I think is really interesting. Actually, it'd be worthwhile to see how much that would change the land. I suspect it would change the landscape rather significantly. But
it might.
The criticism.
Peter Gurry kind of has already done that in his PhD. So
has he?
He basically switched he made the Byzantine text the Ausgangs text, and tried to see what would happen. And it was a little bit of a thought experiment. It's not massively worked out. But he worked through, what would happen if you let's assume that the Byzantine text is the Ausgangs text, the initial text, and what difference would that make to the whole process? It was quite an interesting little thought experiment. Anyway, that's cool.
But
it can be done. It can be done. This whole idea of let's remove certain witnesses, or let's switch the priority of certain witnesses around and see what happens. It can be done in the CBGM. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, because I'm going through those 16 verses that appear in the King James but don't appear in modern translations, and I'm a Byzantine guy, so most of those should remain according to my own presupposition. But it's interesting in looking. I think I've done 3 or 4 of them so far, and in looking at those specifically, if you were to take Aleph and B out, it would significantly alter the choice made. At least in the 4 that I've looked at so far. At least that, I mean, I could be wrong again. I'm not like an expert. I'm not, I'm not schooled in this for 20 years and went off to seminary and all that kind of stuff. But it certainly looks as though it would greatly weaken the argument that the modern critical text has for removing these passages. All that to say is CBGM is really complicated. And some people think it's just a matter of, just unplugging one witness and then rerunning it and seeing what pops out. But no, decisions got to be made again. The computer doesn't make the decisions. People make the decisions. Then they get inputted into the system. The system does the linking up of the decisions, but doesn't actually make the decisions. So if you take a manuscript out of the decision, then somebody's got to go back in and redo the decision humanly. Like, they got to weigh all the evidence and then plug a decision into the system, and then the system at least that's part of my understanding of how it works. I don't know much else.
As a very lay level description of the CBGM, I think that's pretty accurate. So the CBGM basically just helps keep track of what readings are found in which manuscripts. It helps you compare manuscripts, really compare the texts that are found in manuscripts, and it helps keep track of the decisions you've previously made. So it's an iterative process where you kind of make certain decisions early on, which you might think of as no-brainer decision. Now, obviously, different text critics will disagree as to what is a no-brainer decision. You make your easy decisions first, and as you go along, you leave the harder decisions, for later, and iteratively you work through the data a few times. And the CBGM just, in some ways, just provides you with measurements, and it provides you with a way of keeping track of what you've already decided, and whether that should influence your decisions. Now, clearly, CBGM isn't useful for some text critical views because you're not interested in making individual decisions about individual reading, depending on your if that's your view. Some people say find the best manuscript or find the best text type or whatever.
Sure.
But if you have the view that you have to make a decision about each individual reading, then the CBGM is kind of the way to go. If you want to look at each individual reading and how the external evidence stacks up for that reading, and how your previous decisions should influence your subsequent decisions. Yeah.